Summer, 1944. The dusty Texas wind carried the smell of dry grass and machine oil across the barbed wire fences of Camp Huntsville. Beneath the scorching sun, a column of German prisoners stepped off the back of a military transport truck, blinking against the blinding light. Among them was Hans Bauer, a 27-year-old former map draftsman from Hamburg. His boots hit the ground with a dull thud, and for a moment he stood still, taking in the strange new world. The endless blue sky, the watchtowers on the perimeter, the armed guards leaning lazily on their rifles, all of it felt both alien and uncomfortably permanent. Hans carried himself with quiet alertness. His thin frame and wire-rimmed glasses made him look like a clerk, not a soldier, but his eyes never stopped moving. He noted the rhythm of the guards' patrols, the distance between the barracks, even the way shadows fell across the compound at different times of day. To the American guards, he was just another captured German. To Hans, this was a new kind of battlefield, one fought with patience, observation, and ink instead of bullets. As the prisoners were marched toward the processing building, the heat rose in shimmering waves off the ground. A sergeant shouted orders in English, which most of the men didn't fully understand. They were herded into a line where their names were recorded, fingerprints taken, and meager belongings inspected. Hans watched as a fellow prisoner tried to keep a folded photograph of his family. The guard confiscated it, not out of cruelty, but because every scrap of paper was checked. The Americans were thorough. The camp itself was laid out like a small town rows of long wooden barracks, a mess hall, workshops, a small hospital, and guard towers spaced evenly along the perimeter. Surrounding it all were double fences topped with barbed wire. In between those fences ran a narrow patrol road where jeeps passed regularly. To an untrained eye, it was an impenetrable cage. But to Hans, trained in surveying and map-making, the geometry of the place was something he could memorize like the lines on a blueprint. His first night in the barracks was hot and restless. The air smelled of sweat and pine wood. The men lay on their bunks whispering in German about their capture, about rumors of the war turning against them, about families back home. Hans listened more than he spoke. He noticed how certain groups of men clustered together, the veterans, the officers, the quiet ones who avoided attention. He also noticed something subtler, the glances exchanged between a few men near the back of the barracks, almost like a silent language. When the lights went out, they didn't sleep immediately. They whispered too softly to be understood, but Hans heard the rhythm. It wasn't idle talk, it was coordination. The following days passed with monotonous routine. Roll call at dawn, meals in the mess hall, assigned labor details in the fields or workshops. Hans was placed on a maintenance crew repairing fences, which gave him an excellent view of the perimeter. While others grumbled about the heat, he counted fence posts, memorized the spacing between guard towers, and sketched crude layouts in the dirt with a stick, erasing them before anyone could notice. To the guards, he was obedient and quiet. To his fellow Germans, he seemed harmless. But in his mind, every angle and shadow was becoming part of a larger picture. Occasionally, American officers would stroll through the camp, clipboard in hand, inspecting the work. Hans noticed one of them, Lieutenant Jenkins, a young officer with a habit of tapping his pen against his teeth as he observed. Jenkins didn't speak German, but his eyes were sharp. Hans made sure to look unremarkable whenever the lieutenant passed by. He understood that in this new environment, the most dangerous thing he could be was noticeable. At night, Hans kept mental notes alive by repeating the camp's layout silently to himself like a prayer. 2 fences, 10 guard towers, 3 gates, 1 patrol road. He was careful never to write anything down. The American mail censors were known to open and read every letter. Even the drawings children sent home were examined for hidden codes. Hans, however, had a different skill. He didn't need paper to remember. He had spent years tracing blueprints by hand. Lines and proportions lived in his mind with photographic clarity. One evening, after weeks of routine, Hans noticed something unusual. A group of older German non-commissioned officers gathered near the laundry hut after lights out. No guards were nearby at that moment. They spoke briefly, passed something small between their hands, and dispersed. Hans caught only a glimpse of the object flat, folded and yellowed like old paper. It vanished into a jacket pocket. It wasn't food or cigarettes. It looked like a map. Hans lay awake that night staring at the dark ceiling. He realized he was not the only one observing. There was an entire undercurrent of activity running through the camp, invisible to the guards, but obvious to someone like him. The camp was quiet, but beneath that quiet ran tension-like lines under parchment waiting for ink. For Hans Bauer, captivity in Texas was not simply about waiting for the war to end. It was a challenge, a puzzle, and puzzles were what he understood best. The days melted together beneath the relentless Texas sun, but beneath the surface of that routine, Hans Bauer began to sense a pattern. Life inside the camp appeared orderly. Morning roll call, work assignments, meals, recreation, evening lockup. But if one watched closely, as Hans did, another structure revealed itself. Certain prisoners lingered in specific spots at the same times each day. Certain groups moved between workshops and barracks on predictable, synchronized paths. And always, when the guards weren't looking, quiet conversations flared like sparks in the shadows. The first real glimpse came on a late afternoon in September. Hans had been assigned to sweep the corridor of the woodworking shed. The shed was usually noisy with hammering and saws, but that day the tools were oddly still. Two older Germans in worn field jackets stood near a stack of lumber, pretending to discuss measurements. Hans recognized one of them immediately. Oberfeldwebel Karl Dietrich, a former non-commissioned officer with a cold, precise demeanor. His reputation among the prisoners was that of a man who gave orders, not suggestions. The other, a thin Bavarian clerk named Meyer, nervously glanced at the windows as they spoke in low voices. Hans pretended to sweep, pushing sawdust slowly across the floor. He caught snippets of their conversation, not enough to form complete sentences, but enough to hear the rhythm of coded phrases. Harvest soon, letters, river at night. These were not words of men discussing woodworking. When they noticed Hans, Dietrich's gaze landed on him like a rifle barrel. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then Dietrich gave a thin smile, as if acknowledging Hans's intelligence. "Work fast, draftsman," he said in German, loud enough for the nearby guard to hear. "This floor won't clean itself." It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't friendly either. Hans nodded, head lowered. That evening, after lights out, Hans lay awake in the sweltering barracks. Men whispered again near the back, the same small cluster as before. He recognized the cadence now short bursts, pauses, a hiss of air through teeth, as if practicing restraint. He began to piece it together, a clandestine network inside the camp. It wasn't a single escape plan. It was a layered structure. Information flowed through quiet conversations, coded letters, hidden signals. Dietrich and men like him sat at the center, using their old military discipline to keep control. Hans had no desire to lead any rebellion. He was not a soldier by nature. He was an observer, a map maker. But observation led to understanding, and understanding eventually demanded involvement. He started noticing meeting places, behind the laundry shed after evening roll call, near the vegetable garden during work shifts, and inside the woodworking shed on days when guards rotated. The Americans were relaxed. After all, they believed they were thousands of miles from the front. They saw the Germans as isolated and powerless. It was a dangerous underestimation. Weeks passed. Hans began to attract attention, not because he spoke, but because he listened. A quiet man who never drew suspicion made the perfect courier. One afternoon, while repairing a fence near the northwest perimeter, a tall, broad-shouldered prisoner named Vogel approached him. Vogel was a veteran, missing 2 fingers on his right hand. Without preamble, he spoke softly in German. "You are a draftsman in Hamburg, yes?" Hans stiffened. "I was." "Then you see things others don't," Vogel said. He handed Hans a folded scrap of paper. It was blank. "Return this to me tomorrow. You'll know what to do with it." Hans spent the night studying the scrap under his bunk's thin blanket. It looked like ordinary brown wrapping paper from the mess hall. But under the light of a stolen match, faint pencil indentations became visible, a test drawing. Straight lines, measured spacing, like someone checking the quality of the paper for drafting. It was an invitation. The next day, Hans gave the blank paper back to Vogel with a small nod. No words were exchanged. That night, Vogel introduced him to the heart of the network. In a dim corner of the woodworking shed, away from guard lanterns, Hans met Dietrich properly. The older man's eyes were sharp. "We've seen how you look at things," Dietrich said. "This camp has walls, but every wall has a weak point. We intend to find ours." Hans was not shocked. They all dreamed of escape in some way, but Dietrich's tone wasn't wistful. It was logistical. "We send letters home," he continued. "They censor every word, but they do not censor their own assumptions. A letter that looks like family news passes, and sometimes a drawing speaks more clearly than words." That was when Hans understood his role. They wanted him to draw, not to lead, not to fight, to create maps. Maps that could slip through the censors, travel across the ocean, and reach someone in Germany who still had connections to the remnants of their military structure. Whether those maps were meant to inform German command, to prepare for future escapes, or simply to keep pride alive was unclear. But Hans was drawn in almost naturally, like ink flowing into etched lines. Over the following weeks, the network became more tangible to him. They communicated through mundane activities. Chess games where pawn moves indicated meeting times, laundry hung in patterns to signal watchtower rotations, carefully timed coughs during roll call to pass messages down a line. Each small action on its own meant nothing. Together, they formed a living web beneath the Americans' noses. Hans's drafting talent gave him access to a unique position. He was asked to memorize the camp's geography more precisely than anyone else. Guard shift changes, distances between fences, the spacing of floodlights. His mental blueprints became the foundation of something bigger. Dietrich was careful. Nothing was written yet, but it was clear a map would eventually be made, and Hans would be the one to draw it. As autumn crept into Texas and the nights grew cooler, Hans realized he was no longer just a passive observer. He had become part of the invisible structure, a node in a network that thrived on silence and precision. The camp appeared unchanged to the guards orderly, controlled, dull. But to Hans, every fence post and whispered word was part of a vast, fragile machine waiting for a single line to be drawn. The day Hans Bauer finally began to draw the map was a still, windless afternoon in late October. The Texas air had cooled, but the sunlight remained harsh, bleaching everything into sharp contrasts: fences, shadows, faces. By then, Hans had memorized every angle of the camp. He could close his eyes and walk through it in his mind, counting steps between towers, tracing the curve of the patrol road, feeling where the fence sagged slightly between posts 37 and 42 on the western perimeter. It started innocently. He was given a blank sheet of standard camp stationery, thin, lined paper, the same kind prisoners used to write censored letters home. The sheets were collected and checked before being sent overseas. Vogel, the veteran who had first tested him, placed the sheet on his bunk without a word. Hans didn't need instructions. He understood that this paper was no ordinary letter. It was a canvas for precision. At night, when the barracks fell into uneasy silence, Hans lay on his stomach beneath the lower bunk, using the dim light leaking from the hallway as illumination. He began with faint pencil lines, drawn so softly that from a distance they looked like accidental creases. The camp's rectangular shape emerged first, its long sides carefully measured against the paper's ruled lines. Then came the towers, marked with minuscule dots at exact intervals. He drew the double fence, one solid line, one dashed just as they were in reality, the outer fence topped with barbed wire, and the inner fence slightly taller, with a patrol road between. He worked slowly, methodically. Each night he added a little more: the gate structures, the work sheds, the latrines, and even the shadows cast by buildings at midday details that might seem artistic, but in truth were directional markers. Anyone who understood mapmaking could use these shadows to orient themselves, even without a compass. His drafting hand was steady. Years spent in architectural offices in Hamburg had taught him to control even the tiniest tremor. But this was not just a map of buildings. Hidden within the layout were tiny symbols known only to the inner circle of the network. A barely perceptible notch on the western fence line indicated a weak post, where the ground dipped slightly, making tunneling easier. A faint smudge between two dots marked the blind spot of a guard tower, discovered when Hans observed that one of the American searchlights had a damaged reflector. Each symbol was subtle enough to look like a mistake to an untrained eye. The challenge wasn't drawing the map. The challenge was making it disappear in plain sight. If the Americans found the sheet, they'd burn it and interrogate everyone. Dietrich proposed hiding it in a hollowed-out plank in the woodworking shed, but Hans disagreed. The safest way wasn't to hide it in the camp. It was to send it out of the camp entirely, folded innocuously inside a letter. They devised the plan carefully. Hans would write a letter to his sister in Hamburg. It would be deliberately banal updates about the weather, food, and the boredom of daily routine. The map would be drawn on the back of the paper, but in such faint pencil that it was barely visible. Then, over the drawing, Hans would write the letter in German script, the text acting as camouflage for the lines beneath. When folded, the map would be inside the creases, invisible at a glance. Weeks of preparation led to that one quiet night in the barracks. Hans sat upright on his bunk, holding the letter in his hands. It looked innocent. Lines of neat handwriting talked about the unbearable heat, the quality of bread in the camp, the fact that he had started learning a little English. Nowhere did it mention fences or guards. But if someone held the paper against the light, the skeletal layout of the camp would shine through faintly. He hesitated before giving it to Vogel the next morning. The risk was enormous. If the letter was intercepted, not only the map but the entire network could be exposed. Vogel seemed unconcerned. "It will pass," he said. "The Americans have grown lazy. They skim letters, they don't study them." Hans wasn't so sure. He had observed the mail censors, young American clerks with sharp pencils and sharper instincts. But the network was counting on him, so he handed the letter over. The next step of the plan was beyond Hans's control. All outgoing prisoner letters were collected twice a week and sent to the censorship office, a small wooden building near the administrative wing. There, American soldiers opened each envelope, flattened the paper, and read every line. Any suspicious content, military information, propaganda, coded phrases was underlined, removed, or blacked out. Drawings were especially scrutinized. But faint pencil lines under text? That was something different. It relied on human error, on fatigue, on the assumption that no one would look deeper. Hans watched the letter's journey from a distance. He saw the mail cart roll past the fence, saw the sack of envelopes tossed casually onto a table outside the office. Once it crossed that line, it was no longer his. It belonged to chance, to the attentiveness or inattentiveness of a stranger. In the days that followed, Hans carried on as usual. He swept floors, counted fence posts, attended roll calls. But inwardly, he waited. Every creak of boots outside the barracks made his heart beat faster. If the Americans found the map, they wouldn't come quietly. They'd arrive in numbers, and they'd know exactly where to look. But at night, lying on his bunk, Hans allowed himself to imagine the alternative. He pictured his sister in Hamburg opening the letter. He imagined the paper held against the lamplight, the faint lines revealing themselves like ghosts. He imagined someone, maybe a military contact, maybe an old colleague reading it carefully, tracing escape routes across the Atlantic. The idea was almost intoxicating. A single sheet of paper could turn captivity into power. He didn't know it yet, but the fate of that folded letter was about to shift everything. The letter left the camp on a Wednesday morning, bundled into a canvas mailbag along with dozens of others written by German prisoners. It was driven by jeep to the U.S. Army Postal Censorship Station, a squat wooden building just outside the perimeter. Inside, the air smelled of ink, paper, and stale coffee. Rows of desks filled the room, each occupied by American clerks in khaki shirts, sleeves rolled up, eyes fixed on letters under bright lamps. Every single piece of mail sent by captured Germans passed through this place before it ever touched a ship bound for Europe. The censors had a routine. Envelopes were opened carefully, their contents flattened and examined. Letters were read line by line. Drawings or maps were strictly forbidden. Any found were destroyed immediately. Suspicious phrases were underlined in red pencil, and translations were checked against intelligence code books. Most days it was monotonous work, but on that particular day, Private First Class Robert Langley was on duty at one of the desks. He was 21 years old, bored, and nursing a headache from the previous night's poker game. Still, he was meticulous by nature. He pulled Hans Bauer's letter from the pile without any special attention. The handwriting was neat, the envelope unremarkable. He began reading, mouthing the German words softly as he worked through them with his limited language skills. The weather is hot, bread is dry, learning English. Nothing unusual. He almost moved it to the cleared stack, but something stopped him. As he folded the letter back up, the light from the desk lamp caught a faint glimmer. Pencil marks beneath the ink, like veins under skin. Langley frowned and held the sheet closer to the light. He tilted it slowly, and the hidden geometry revealed itself. Thin, careful lines, dots in perfect intervals, faint shadows that didn't match the text above. He wasn't fluent in German, but he recognized a map when he saw one. He didn't shout or sound an alarm. Instead, he placed the letter on a separate pile, face down, and marked it with a small blue paperclip as signal to the supervising intelligence officer. Within an hour, Lieutenant Jenkins, the same sharp-eyed officer Hans had noticed weeks earlier inside the camp, entered the censorship building. He had been assigned to monitor potential escape or intelligence operations. When Langley showed him the sheet against the light, Jenkins didn't need to read German. The layout was clear. Fences, towers, barracks, even the patrol road. "Someone in that camp," Jenkins said quietly, "has been busy." By that afternoon, the letter was photographed and forwarded to the camp's military intelligence unit. The original was kept as evidence. Jenkins didn't act immediately. He was deliberate. He knew that if one man had drawn a map, others might be involved. He ordered surveillance of internal prisoner activity to begin discreetly. Guards were instructed to watch for unusual movements, gatherings after lights out, or repeated visits to specific work areas. The network had unknowingly exposed itself. Meanwhile, inside the camp, Hans went about his days unaware that the walls had started closing in. A week had passed since he handed over the letter. He took the lack of reaction as a sign of success. He imagined the letter already somewhere over the Atlantic, packed among Red Cross shipments and correspondence, making its way toward Hamburg. A quiet confidence grew in him. In the barracks at night, when Vogel asked with a raised eyebrow if everything had gone as planned, Hans allowed himself a small nod. "They didn't notice," he whispered, "but the Americans had noticed, and they were watching." The guards' behavior changed subtly. Searchlights lingered longer on certain fences at night. Work details were shuffled. Vogel's woodworking crew was reassigned to the gardens without explanation. One evening, a sudden unannounced barracks inspection caught everyone by surprise. American MPs stormed in with flashlights, ordering men off their bunks, flipping mattresses, checking every locker and floorboard. They found nothing. Hans's map was already in the hands of intelligence, but the message was clear. Something had alerted them. Lieutenant Jenkins chose not to interrogate Hans immediately. Instead, he wanted to identify the entire chain, not just the draftsman. He watched quietly as the network tried to adapt. Dietrich became more cautious, shifting meetings to random locations, breaking larger groups into pairs. But in doing so, they made small mistakes. 2 prisoners were caught lingering near the laundry hut after dark. Another was found with an extra scrap of paper tucked into his boot. None of them cracked under questioning, but the pattern was forming. Hans noticed the tension growing. Vogel spoke less. Dietrich's eyes, usually cold and composed, now scanned every corner like a hunted animal. Rumors spread through the barracks that a letter had been intercepted somewhere in the censorship office. Nobody admitted responsibility, but the whispers turned sharp. "Someone was careless," Meyer muttered one night. "Someone didn't disguise it well enough." Hans kept silent. He told himself there was no proof that the intercepted letter was his. But deep down, unease settled in his stomach. He had spent his life trusting lines and measurements, not luck, and now everything depended on someone else's perception under a lamp. Outside the camp, Lieutenant Jenkins moved methodically. He ordered aerial photos of the compound to be compared with the captured map. Every tower, every fence matched exactly. This wasn't a crude sketch, Jenkins told his superiors. This was drawn by someone trained. Whoever did this wasn't guessing. By the end of the second week, Jenkins had quietly compiled a list of namesmen who worked near the perimeter, men who had been seen near the woodworking shed, men who rarely spoke but observed everything. At the top of that list, thanks to reports from guards and careful observation, was Hans Bauer. The stage was set. The map had done its job not for the Germans, but for the Americans. What had begun as a carefully planned act of resistance had turned into a thread that, once pulled, would unravel everything Hans and the network had built in silence. The night the Americans made their move was damp and unusually quiet. A thin mist settled over Camp Huntsville, blurring the harsh outlines of the fences and towers. Inside the barracks, most of the men were asleep or pretending to be. Hans Bauer lay on his bunk, hands behind his head, staring into the darkness. The last few days had been tense. Whispers had turned into accusations, and glances between prisoners were no longer friendly. Something was unraveling, and everyone could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. Shortly after midnight, the sound of boots echoed down the gravel paths outside. Flashlights flicked on in synchronized arcs. A sharp voice barked orders in English. The door burst open, and military police flooded in, rifles lowered but ready. "Everybody up! Hands where we can see them!" The German prisoners scrambled, confused and half awake. The Americans moved with cold precision. This was not a random inspection. It was a targeted operation. Hans sat up slowly, heart pounding as a sergeant read off a list of names. Dietrich, Vogel, Meyer, Bauer. His stomach dropped when he heard his name. He was pulled from his bunk and lined up with the others outside in the mist. The searchlights from the nearest tower bathed them in harsh white light, flattening their faces into stark masks. Around them, other prisoners watched silently from the shadows, unsure whether to pity or distance themselves. They were taken to a small interrogation building on the administrative side of the camp. The walls were bare. A single hanging bulb lit the room. Lieutenant Jenkins was there, sleeves rolled up, a folder on the table in front of him. The intercepted letter lay inside, carefully flattened and protected. Jenkins didn't speak immediately. He studied their faces one by one, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but deliberate. Someone in this room drew this. He held the sheet up to the light. The map lines glowed faintly beneath the handwritten text, an X-ray of the camp's secrets. This wasn't a doodle. This was professional work, and we know it was meant to reach Germany. Dietrich, ever the officer, didn't flinch. "We write letters," he said evenly. "There's no crime in that." "Drawing my camp," Jenkins replied, "is not a letter." He turned to Hans. "You worked as a draftsman, didn't you?" Hans froze. He hadn't told anyone among the Americans about his past. They must have learned from work assignments and quiet observation. He tried to keep his expression neutral. "I repaired fences," he said softly. Jenkins leaned forward. "You drew this. I know it. You know it. But I'm not after just the artist. I want the network." His eyes swept over Dietrich and the others. "This didn't happen alone. Someone coordinated. Someone passed this along. I can take this to a military tribunal right now, or I can give one of you the chance to make this easier." No one spoke. The silence was a shield. Dietrich's gaze bored into Hans, steady and cold as if warning him without words. Vogel clenched his jaw. Meyer looked like he might faint. Jenkins didn't push further. He had time. He ordered the men separated, each into a different barrack room converted for questioning. The next 48 hours blurred into a pattern of interrogation and isolation. The Americans didn't use brutality. They didn't need to. They used patience, light, silence, and well-timed information. They showed Hans aerial photographs matched to the map. They asked why a simple maintenance worker knew precise tower distances. They pointed out how the letter had been passed through Vogel's hands, how Dietrich had chosen him. Every question was precise, like pins pressing against a map. Hans tried to resist. He told himself he was only a draftsman, not a conspirator. But Jenkins was clever. He didn't demand confessions. He offered suggestions. "I don't need you to betray anyone," he said quietly. "Just tell me how you drew it. Tell me why you added the shadow marks. You're too good at this for it to be an accident." It was in these long, silent sessions that Hans began to feel something he hadn't expected. Doubt. Dietrich's plan had seemed foolproof. But now, sitting alone under the buzzing light, Hans began to see how every line he'd drawn was like a thread leading straight back to him. Dietrich would not protect him. Vogel wouldn't either. If someone had to take the fall, the mapmaker was the obvious choice. Meanwhile, outside the interrogation rooms, the Americans were closing the net. Guards doubled their patrols. Work assignments were reorganized. Letters were temporarily halted. A team searched the woodworking shed and found hollowed planks empty now, but enough to confirm there had been something. Meyer cracked first. He wasn't the mastermind, but under pressure, he admitted that there had been a plan to send information overseas. He claimed not to know who drew the map, but it was enough to validate Jenkins's suspicions. The next day, Hans was brought back into the room with Jenkins. The lieutenant didn't look triumphant. He looked tired, like someone piecing together a puzzle he already knew the shape of. He placed the map on the table between them. "This," he said, tapping the faint lines with his finger, "is what got you here. You're good, very good. But this is over." Hans didn't answer. His silence said enough. By the end of the week, the network was dismantled. Dietrich and Vogel were transferred to a high-security compound in another state, their leadership broken. Meyer was kept for further questioning. Hans, identified as the draftsman but not the instigator, was placed under restricted status. He wasn't executed or sent to prison. The Americans treated him as a valuable source rather than a hardened spy. But the quiet life he had lived in the camp was over. Every letter he wrote, every step he took, every glance at a fence was now watched. In the barracks, the other prisoners understood what had happened without needing to be told. Conversations stopped when Hans entered. Some looked at him with pity, others with resentment. He had drawn the map that connected them all, and that same map had led to their undoing. The weeks that followed were marked by a strange, heavy silence. The network that had once hummed beneath the surface of Camp Huntsville was gone, dismantled line by line like one of Hans Bauer's own blueprints being erased from the drafting table. The woodworking shed stood quieter than ever. The laundry hut, once a hub of whispered exchanges, became just another part of the daily routine. Even the evening barracks, usually alive with murmurs in the dark, were subdued. Something vital had been excised from the camp, and everyone felt it. Hans lived in the same physical space, but everything around him had shifted. His bunk was the same, his work assignment nominally unchanged, but now there were 2 guards posted near his group at all times. His letters were opened twice, once in front of him, once in the censorship office. He was no longer invisible. The Americans didn't treat him cruelly. In fact, Lieutenant Jenkins occasionally stopped him to ask quiet, probing questions, as if still curious about the mind behind the map. But the unseen freedom Hans once enjoyed, the ability to observe unnoticed, had evaporated. At night, lying awake in the dim barracks, he replayed the moment when Jenkins had held the letter to the light, that soft glow revealing his lines. He had spent his life believing that precision was power, that if something was measured perfectly, it could be controlled. But here, his precision had betrayed him. The map that should have been his silent victory had become the evidence that pulled everything apart. The others treated him with wary distance. Dietrich and Vogel were gone, but their influence lingered like smoke after a fire. Some prisoners blamed him outright for the collapse of the network, even though none of them could prove it. Others simply avoided him, as though proximity to him carried risk. Meyer, the Bavarian clerk who had faltered under questioning, wouldn't meet his eyes anymore. Jenkins continued his quiet observation. Sometimes he passed by Hans during work detail, offering nothing more than a nod. He had gotten what he wanted, the map, the network, the control, but in an odd way, he seemed to respect Hans's skill. One afternoon in the maintenance yard, Jenkins paused beside him and said softly, "If you'd been born here, you might have worked for the Corps of Engineers." It wasn't a taunt. It was almost a remark of professional acknowledgement. Hans didn't answer. He simply returned to repairing the fence, the the same fence he had once traced so carefully in his mind. As winter crept into Texas, the rhythm of the camp settled into a new normal. The Americans remained vigilant, but the sense of threat had faded. There were no more secret maps, no whispered codes in the laundry lines. Some prisoners accepted their situation more passively. Others nurtured quiet resentment, but no one attempted anything of the same scale again. The intercepted letter had become a cautionary legend within the campus story of brilliance undone by the thinness of paper and the angle of a desk lamp. Hans's role in that story was both central and invisible. The Americans never publicly announced who had drawn the map. They didn't need to. The result spoke for itself. The network was gone, and Jenkins's superiors praised his foresight in tightening censorship protocols. Mailrooms across other camps began using backlighting inspections for every outgoing letter, a new procedure born directly from Hans's handiwork. In a way, his map changed more than just one camp. It changed how the Americans watched all of them. One cold night in December, Hans sat outside the barracks after lights out, wrapped in his thin blanket, staring up at the unfamiliar constellations in the Texan sky. The fences were outlined faintly against the moonlight, their geometry still etched into his memory. He realized something quietly. He had never truly believed the map would reach home. It had always been a calculation, if not of success, then of defiance. A way of asserting that even within fences his mind could wander freely, draw lines no guard could see. But reality had drawn its own lines, and they were sharper than his. In the years after the war, some of the men who had been in Camp Huntsville would tell stories of the map incident with a mix of admiration and bitterness. They would describe the German draftsman who drew with such precision that even American intelligence officers took notice. They would say that his work was almost perfect, but not quite. Hans Bauer remained in American custody until the end of the war. He was never tried, never decorated, never punished beyond surveillance. He was simply absorbed back into the anonymous flow of men waiting to go home. His map, however, lived on in military archives, an artifact of a quiet battle fought not with rifles, but with graphite and paper. For Hans, the story ended not with escape or triumph, but with a lesson etched deeper than any line he had ever drawn. In war, even the most careful plan can hinge on a single unseen glance under the right light. And that single glance had changed everything.